Good evening and welcome to the meeting of the Scrutiny Panel, first meeting of this municipal year. The first order of business is the election of Chair and Vice Chair. I'd like to ask for nominations for the position of Chair.
I nominate Councillor Gordon.
I duly announce that Councillor Gordon is elected as Chair of the Scrutiny Panel. I'll now hand over the meeting to Councillor Gordon.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. People hear me online?
We can.
We can, Councillor Gordon.
Thanks very much, Deputy Mayor Bramble. Welcome to the meeting scrutiny panel, to all our guests in the virtual meeting room and to everyone watching online. This meeting is being recorded and live streamed now. Please can you all keep your microphones on mute throughout the meeting, as this will prevent any audio feedback. If you're still getting feedback, please turn off nearby devices. If you'd like to speak, raise your hand to get my attention. State your name and affiliation before you make a comment. The chat function must not be used to have conversations with other participants or provide personal information. All chat is recorded as it's a formal meeting. Please only use the chat function to alert me that you wish to speak or raise points of order or technical problems. This is a formal meeting of Hackney Council. Please note the press may be in attendance. The rights of the press and public to record and film the meeting will apply. So going on to agenda item 1, are there any nominations for Vice Chair? No nominations. This is a position reserved to, for the principal opposition group. So there's nobody present from that. I don't think they've nominated. So I think there's nobody eligible for that position. Thank you. So agenda item 2, apologies for absence. I've got apologies from Councillor Billington, Councillor Potter, Councillor Joseph, and also Councillor Maxwell, who's not a member of the Commission but was going to be attending the Ageing Well item. Are there any other apologies? And Councillor Hayhurst for lateness, who'll be joining us later. Agenda item 3, urgent items business. I haven't been notified of any. Agenda item 4, declarations of interest. Do any members wish to declare any interest? No, thank you very much. Okay, so our first agenda item is the Ageing Well strategy. This item is to review the work of the Council in relation to implementing the Ageing Well strategy to achieve the Council's broader objectives and aspirations to support residents as they grow older in Hackney. To support the discussion, there's going to be a presentation. I'd like to welcome Councillor Chris Kennedy, the Cabinet Member for Health, Adult Social Care, Voluntary Sector and Culture, Sonia Khan, Head of Policy and Strategic Delivery, and Councillor Yvonne Maxwell, who's the mayoral advisor for this area. Unfortunately, has had to give her apologies. So is there anyone else who's attending for this item? No. Thank you very much. So I'll invite Sonia Khan to unmute her microphone and to present this item. Thank you.
Can you hear me okay? Okay, thanks for inviting me to talk about this today. So I'm going to talk about the Ageing Well strategy, which is adopted in 2020 and is a way of thinking about life in the borough for older people that goes beyond thinking about the individual services. It really is about the experience of the borough and how the borough can become more age friendly. So if we can go on to the next slide. And this was a manifesto commitment from the last administration, but it was also something that, looking at the data, it was a real opportunity to focus on beyond the political commitment. It's key to thinking about prevention, how we make sure that people can age well, but it's also key to really making sure we get the best out of older people and value them. Hackney can seem like a very young, visibly young population, and yet there are people who are contributing a lot as they grow older, either helping with childcare or other caring responsibilities or volunteering. So it's just valuing all of that. So the strategy that has a vision in it, which is to be an age-friendly borough and somewhere that's a good place for people to live and grow old in, and that people feel, this very much speaks to what I was saying, feel empowered, informed, valued, supported, and that there's both the whole community approach, but also services and specialist care as needs arise. So the strategy seeks to try and understand and respond to the needs of and interests of older people, looking at the borough, but also looking at people's needs in their immediate locality, making sure that our services are age-friendly and our policies and practices, but also supporting a wider culture shift in how older people are perceived and supported. And again, moving away from that idea, we only think about older people when we're thinking about services. Similar with Young Futures, trying to get away from the idea that we only think about children and young people when we think about children and young people services, and thinking children are a key stakeholder in the borough. And actually, I think for both age groups, thinking about the whole council and the whole borough with those two age groups in mind just helps us to actually deliver better services that are future-proofed as well. So it is a council strategy. That was a conscious decision that was made, but it is very much about influencing partners and the voluntary and community sector and supporting a shared vision. So if we can go on to the next slide, please. So we developed this strategy. Part of the manifesto commitment was that it was co-produced with local people. And so the first thing that we wanted to do was think about what that actually would mean. But we wanted to make sure that in co-producing the strategy with older people, we weren't taking older people through a process of discovery, inverted commas, where we got all the information from them that they told us many times over already. So I think the important thing about co-production is that you don't waste people's time. You don't say, come, you know, we're really enthusiastic, we're working on this strategy, this is all new to us, tell us what you know. And so we wanted to take stock of existing local data and indeed national and international research about older people. And we wanted to start with finding out about who was involved in working with older people already and who would have some insight. And then started with actually some informal focus groups to start to explore what life was like in the borough as people grew older. So we could then design a co-production that drew on all of that. And when I talk about existing local data, as you'll see in the strategy, there's a lot of data that is quantitative, that's based on national data sets, but there's also, we did a full synthesis of everything that had been done before and talked about before, including, I mean, scrutiny commissions had looked, for example, at over 50s employment needs in the past. So just trying to make sure we were doing justice to that intelligence that was there already. And then we recruited a group of peer facilitators. We worked with Connect Hackney. It made sense to value the focus on older people that the local civil society was already taking, rather than try and do something ourselves. And they were trained in community research. And then they worked to co-design the discussion and went out and spoke to older people. 400 people were engaged in total. And we went to many different settings where older people were and asked questions about the borough and what it was like. And then started to look at the themes and brought together stakeholders and that group of peer facilitators to look at the insight together and start to develop the recommendations. So they were also co-produced. When I say co-produced, you know, it was really important at that point that stakeholders and older people came together to look at the issues together and start to form the recommendations, so that we didn't have that us and them at that point. And then there was also some roundtables with groups and online and offline consultation. Now we were doing that during the pandemic, and that was challenging, but we did take the view, because a lot of the work, the engagement with older people was done in 2019, and then we had to pause that engagement, but we were at the point where we were trying to pull it together in a strategy in early 2020, and we took the view that there was more risk from pausing completely to older people, because actually we could see older people were being impacted by the pandemic. So if we were going to stop and wait until a point at time when it was safe to do fully offline in-person consultation, we wouldn't even be there now. So we took that view, but we did actually offer a telephone conversation, and Soraya, who was the lead officer throughout, who's just left the council, but whose presentation this is, and I can talk about how I'll be covering that role. You know, did have really good conversations on the phone that was offered. So it was adopted in Cabinet in December 2020, which, as I say, was as late as we could push it without feeling that there would other risks would emerge. So the priority areas for the strategy focus on different interlocking areas, and we're trying to get away from the idea of looking at this through a service by service lens. So health and well-being, looking at public space, transportation, mobility, housing, safeguarding, safety and security, employment and skills, our own role as an employer of an older workforce, and social and civic inclusion, and that recognises what I was saying about the contribution that older people make. So if we can go on to the next slide, please. But one of the things that we do talk about quite a lot in thinking about strategy is recognising that there's no point just looking at what we do. How we deliver matters a great deal. So jargon, enablers, that's the second time I've used that word. The first time I was at the anti-racism BCS assembly, and I talked about enablers, and there was a jargon, there was a way of being able to say, and I did, so I apologise, it's more jargon. But the point is that really is about what are the conditions that are going to make this strategy successful? So older people continuing to be involved, joined up working rather than going to individual council service areas, thinking about the whole borough and how inclusive the borough can be, being able to communicate what's going on, and have that flow, which I will openly say is challenging, and obviously there's a manifesto commitment that continues to look at how we amplify this, and looking at shared approaches, so looking at how we actually build more consistent approaches to making life in the borough better for older people. So far, as I say, the strategy was adopted in 2020. We did obviously look at the impacts of the pandemic, and part of the roundtable discussion I mentioned did focus on the impacts of the pandemic. So we made sure that we were updating the strategy, even though the co-production had been done before the pandemic. So we also did a couple of things that were really useful to do early on, which was join a UK network of age-friendly communities, and also join the World Health Organisation's global network. And there was a motion passed in council about becoming an age-friendly borough. And then we took the view that we should start by prioritising, putting our resource into recruiting a group of older people to build out from the group of peer facilitators, and so quite a lot of work went into building a group of older people who would be reflective of Hackney's diversity. And actually, often when you look at older people representation, you can lose the diversity, even though there are, for example, the Caribbean population. There's a larger number of older people in the Caribbean population than the younger demographic. So actually we need to recognise and make sure that it's not just reflective of the population of Hackney, but reflective of the population of older people. And so that took quite a lot of effort and work. And then the co-production of the 6 priority areas began later that year. And I'll talk a bit more about the progress to date. But the other thing that we took the opportunity to do was we were invited by central government to put an expression of interest in to something that's part of their shared opportunity outcomes fund, which is about looking at how you can join up central government policy with local systems and with local civil society action. We took that opportunity, we pitched to actually look at how we could develop preventative approaches to health inequalities through engagement, integration and neighbourhoods. And it's the simplest way to put it is, how do we make ageing well real in a real area? Because that will give us another way of being able to develop solutions that we can then try to influence the wider system beyond that area about. But it also gives us something tangible that we can show and then learn from as well. So how are we tracking this? So I'll be honest again, you know, and you might want to explore this in the questions, keeping a focus on this through the pandemic, through the different crises that the council has had to respond to, that have come to my service to respond to, around refugees and around poverty during the pandemic, self-isolation. Yeah, keeping a focus has been difficult, but this is one area that we've wanted to prioritise absolutely through the pandemic, along with young people, young futures, just recognising that these are 2 communities who are going to be disproportionately impacted. But we then did put our focus, first of all, on building up that voice of older people. And that's where a lot of our energy went over summer last year. But we now have developed a delivery plan that looks at all of the commitments made in the strategy, rag rates where we are, and looks at what we need to do next, so that we've got a position now to build off. And I'll talk about this more in next steps. And so then working with the Hackney Older Citizens Committee to feed into that delivery, and then what I now want to do is look at officer level governance to take that delivery plan forward. And so that, as I say, the main focus has been building the older people's voice. But I think feedback so far is that has meant that there's been more embedding of the understanding within council services than perhaps if we'd gone and just, you know, gone to all individual services to say, where are you on the strategy? Where is your progress? It's actually meant that people have had to pause and listen to the voice of older people and reflect in a more open way on what that means for the work they're doing. And so in terms of how we've applied the Ageing Well principles, I apologise, Chair, there's a slide that's duplicated here. So there's actually just a couple of slides. And I apologise that this is not structured because it is work in progress. We're bringing this update in advance of us doing that formal written update within the executive. But the link workers, which you may be aware of within customer services, have taken on early on the opportunity to really look at vulnerability by age and work on how there can be earlier identifications of that. And now there's an opportunity to link that more as well to anticipatory care and to the partnerships for people in place. So that's one thing, it's just recognising vulnerability by age and what can be done through the model that Here to Help are developing anyway, that is focused on older people. What that now means actually as well is that there's the Household Support Fund, the most recent tranche of that requires local authorities to focus a third of its resource on pensioners. But it has meant that by link workers being involved in identifying that, you know, finding ways to identify vulnerable older people, it does mean we've now got a way of being able to also route some of that resource through the same approach, customer services. The Hackney Older Citizen Committee, the voice of older people has been particularly powerful in communicating the importance of social connection and how much that supports well-being and how much social activity and social connection needs to be understood in its own right for its own value, and giving people hope, meaning, purpose, that is so integral to ageing well, especially if somebody's had a bereavement or they've got a caring responsibility. And these things seem irresolvable at a point in your life. You can't see that things might change. So that's been powerful, and that was particularly then helped to make sure that focus on social connection. You know, I think it was another way that the health and wellbeing strategy really, I think, powerfully was able to situate that within the strategy. So I'm not suggesting it was as a result of the voice of older people, but older people really able to articulate the importance of that and the value of that in its own right. It's obviously valuable for other reasons as well. There's been work with adult social care to redesign resident involvement, and there's been work with the culture team to look at some opportunities around intergenerational conversations, which will now continue. And the culture team was already doing a lot of work through Hackney Circle. So it just actually, this work has helped us to expand the opportunities that there are within culture, and within, I suppose, the opportunity to situate intergenerational work within culture gives it a permanence, because otherwise you're always trying to think about intergenerational work as an add-on. But if you're thinking about it as integral to the work that culture might lead, it actually makes it more likely to continue, because it is culture, it's cultural activity then, and it's seen that way. The child-friendly supplementary planning document, I'm sure Councillor Maxwell would want to speak to this more, but that was really interesting in that we were able to try to make sure that if we were looking at things through the lens of children's eyes, could we flip that and actually look at things through the lens of older people and think about age-friendly spaces overall? And again, I think Councillor Maxwell would want to get across in terms of parks, the opportunities that there were to influence the parks strategy, and there's a bit more about that on the next slide as well, in terms of the chatty corner that was piloted in Shoreditch Park. So somewhere where there were benches where people could sit and actually invite conversation. So there was also the library review and the opportunity to contribute to that. And in terms of the housing strategy, there's been some detailed work getting older people's insight into rehousing options, and that's really key. I think it's such a challenge to think about how we go about getting that right, and actually getting the lived experience of what might work will really help to get that policy right. I've talked about Hackney Circle and culture, so I'm just conscious of time. Yeah, I think I've covered most of the main points where I think we've made a real difference. So finally, I mentioned partnerships for people and place. So this is an opportunity to test in a very real way how we make ageing well real in a local area. And so we've worked to get, initially to engage with neighbourhoods, because we wanted to make sure that this was something that was owned by neighbourhoods, and then have worked also with all of the community partners in the area, and to start to map what opportunities there might be. So the next step is to really look at activities that we can support that show how we can better develop activities that support people to age well, but then connect with the wider system. And so that's really about looking at not just funding new activity, not an end-to-end grants programme, but looking at where the gaps and issues are. And actually, since putting in the bid, the detailed bid, we've been able to nuance this more. So we've been able to look at how we can look at space as a key barrier, like where people can run activities, and be able to look at how we can take forward some work that was already going on around community centres there. But also, it's been an opportunity to look at access and the schemes that are going on around the area, and how we might be able to look at getting the voice of older people into planning and the schemes at an early stage. We've been able to take this bit forward, and so it will still have a focus on activities in the area and how we can develop those more, and particularly looking at how we can rethink what reach mean, what access and reach mean. So instead of think about outreach and then an activity, think who are the people who are really best placed in the organisations to engage people. People, going back to that point about social connection, older people want to go because they feel good when they go, and then you can do things there. But that's the way to attract people. So yeah, it's moved on from this, but very much live work. So I didn't update this before submitting it. So essentially, the budget that is available overall is £250,000 in total, with us, which we have to spend in the next, like by March 2023. But we're well on our way to actually designing what we can do. And I think the real I think two key points that have come out already is neighbourhoods being able to see this as a way of being able to deliver anticipatory care by working with civil society organisations, and also the local partners in the area. So I didn't say it's in the Hackney Marsh neighbourhood. The local partners in the area really valuing actually us bringing them together and starting to map and gap together. So there was a real appetite for that and for doing more of that. So in terms of next steps overall, as I say, now that we've got this detailed delivery plan that goes through and assesses where we are on each of the commitments, we'll be establishing officer group governance that looks at the, just allows us to look at progress overall, as well as looking at the providers who are working on this and consistently engaging with them. And then the Hackney Older Citizens Committee, how we need to just refresh the membership. But also, one of the points is that originally we got that we involved the HOC, the Hackney Older Citizens Committee, across those 6 areas of the strategy. And actually, as we've moved on, we've realised that it works better to involve people at a key point when there's something to influence, rather than having standing committees that look at each of those 6 areas. So the further development of the Hackney Older Citizens Committee. There was £80,000 identified in the budget for 2020-2021 as part of the overall poverty reduction budget. And actually we haven't spent that yet. We've rolled it into this year because it didn't make sense to spend it at a point when we could be very start-stop. We could have wasted money. But that money is there to support co-production and to support test pilots, and we're particularly keen to look at employment and also to look at how we might match it with some of the partnerships and people in place. But obviously we want this to be across it would have to be for work that was done across the borough. So I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Sonia, for that presentation. Now, as I said at the beginning, unfortunately, Councillor Maxwell, who's been an absolutely tireless advocate for this strategy, both within council settings and beyond the council, is unfortunately not able to be here this evening. But I think we'll all agree actually that her sort of passion and advocacy for this is one of the underpinnings of what I think is a very successful developing strategy. So I now invite Councillor Kennedy to contribute a few words if you want to.
Thank you very much, Chair. Yeah, Councillor Maxwell, absolutely devastated not to be able to be here. My thanks particularly to her for, as you said, the tireless work she's put in on this. The points that Councillor, you've already indicated, Sonia, some of the things that Councillor Maxwell would very definitely have said. One of the things she's particularly proud of and is really pleased that we've managed to carry on is the way we've kept the co-production going all the way through. So right from the design of the strategy, setting up of the Hackney Older Citizens Committee, and the way that they've actually then, even within the first year of operation, managed to feed in to the various consultations. So as Sonia mentioned, they fed into the library strategy. They're looking now at the housing. They've already looked at the housing strategy, and now they're looking at the resident engagement strategy. So quite a lot of ongoing activity. The click through that you've got in your papers on page 17 to the Ageing Well strategy 1 year on, actually, I think is a really good summary of lots of how activity has been mapped against the strategy even during the first year, and shows how it's come to fruition even in a time of pandemic and uncertainty. Councillor Maxwell is especially proud of Chatty Corner. It was something that not being able to stop and rest was something that came up so often in the focus groups that quite rightly, Councillor Maxwell said, I am going to make this a priority. I'm going to make sure there are places where people can sit, and once they've sat down, also be able to get up from. That was the thing that lots of people didn't quite understand, and Councillor Maxwell had to go to officers and fellow politicians, and I include myself, and go, no, Chris, you don't understand. It's no good just having the same kind of chair or sitting piece of street furniture that everyone else uses. You've actually got to have the place to lever yourself back up from if you're an older person. So yeah, she fought absolutely tirelessly for that and is very proud of that. What's going on in Shoreditch Park now. Likewise, she would mention the intergenerational work and how she's very proud that alongside the child-friendly borough, because child-friendly borough actually wasn't going to specifically talk about intergenerationality, and then it did based on the work that we've done with the Ageing Well strategy. And then the two things for the future I think she would have wanted to highlight are the Partnership for Places and People work that's going on in the Hackney Marsh neighbourhood. That's particularly exciting because it builds on Kings Park Moving Together, which already exists in that area, and I think it was a master stroke by Sonia and Rachel Salmon in her team to choose that neighbourhood, because there was already work and evidence going on the ground. At first I thought, oh, what, they've already got Kings Park Moving Together in that area, why would you choose there? But actually it's because the money's got to be spent quickly, so you actually need to have bits of work that are already going on that you can start to pin things to do your pilots. And I think the second thing for the future I'd want to highlight is that employment pilot, because again, that was one of the things that so many older people said when they were talking to us about the strategy and what they wanted to see it was deliver was, it feels if you lose your job, get made unemployed, take a career break, and then try and get yourself back into employment, especially after around 50, 55, life is really, really hard for you. And there must be some levers that the council can put in to actually make things better and help you get back into employment. And also it very much knocks the sort of like the saga idea on the head. Lots and lots of our older people want to be gainfully employed well into their 60s, and we need to make sure we, and even past 70, and we want to make sure that we're doing our best to make that possible for them. But yes, huge thanks to Sonia and her team, but especially to Councillor Maxwell.
Thanks very much, Councillor Kennedy. Yeah, I mean, I'll sort of start off questions, then I'll sort of invite members to contribute. And I think it's been very, very useful to hear this presentation because, I mean, I think we're possibly sort of in scrutiny still, you know, and across the council still sort of, I suppose, exploring really how the sort of systems change approaches operate. And I think this has been a really, really good example of with the strategy of hearing how that sort of operates in all sorts of different areas. But it would be good to know just if you can build on any points really about sort of how that's evaluated. I think you've touched on some of that really in your presentation. But I think that would be something that'd be very useful for members to understand. And also, I think the other thing that I think has been really admirable about this is actually the co-production, and there's obviously been a really number of different ways of going out to find out where service users are, and to engage them in lots of different ways. And I think that really came out very, very well in your presentation, Sonia, about how that's worked. I think those are also things that we could sort of learn from, I think, in other work across the council. So in terms of questions, I think my first question really is a little bit more maybe about how this can be sort of evaluated, how that sort of fits maybe with all sort of traditional methods of evaluation, and also how this sort of fits in with other cross-cutting strategies, in particular anti-racism and net zero. I think it'd be good to hear a little bit more about that, and then I'll invite questions from other members. Thank you.
So in terms of how you evaluate this sort of work, I mean, there are, in the delivery plan, there are outcomes that we want to achieve that are about influence and also about older people feeling heard and respected. So I suppose that's, you know, I don't want to move away from what we're already trying to look at. I just want to simplify that and say that one key way is to look at whether towards the end of this administration, we can see that the input, the way that older people have influenced strategy at the start, you know, that's leading to something different that's sustained. So that's one way of simplifying that. So I talked about a lot of ways that older people have, their voice has been heard in thinking about social connection or in thinking about rehousing, but does that translate into something different happening as a result that's tangible? And that's why we want to focus on the governance now and the delivery, you know, a focus on governance that doesn't just say, it's not tick box, you know, it doesn't just say, you said you would deliver, you said you would engage with 12 older people by this point in your strategy, have you? Yes, okay, go away. You know, so it has to be more about, so what's happening next? So you've done this, what's going to happen next? What's the next step to then develop that policy further? And then the other point would be to be able to understand whether, like in resident surveys and in other surveys that we do, where are, you know, how do older people feel? I'm not suggesting that you can attribute the success of this strategy to resident perception, but it would be helpful to understand whether just whether that improves or not, without trying to, you know, sort of claim success. But I think the key is to get people who lead services and lead systems to be able to say in a few years' time that as a result of this is what we're now doing, that is different. And that has to start with a conversation and governance that focuses on that from the outset. The question about cross-cutting strategy is a really good one. So again, I think that starts with the data and how rich a set of data we looked at to develop the strategy, because we were very keen from the outset that we were able to get very diverse voices, both from the original data we were looking at, but then also in the co-production. So we tried to make sure that, you know, if there were gaps in the groups who we were reaching, we were able to fill those gaps. So I know that more recently there's been work to look at going into care, you know, get the voice of from people in care homes, look at the experience of people LGBTQ going into care homes as an example. There's people with learning disabilities in the group. So again, now looking at the support that's needed to really make sure that voice is heard. So I think it starts with that. It starts with actually making sure that you have got a really diverse range of views feeding into the strategy. In terms of how we're then influencing wider agendas, so the anti-racist example is a really good one, because that does go back to actually the thinking at the start that we need to make sure there were a diverse range of perspectives feeding in. But then where that takes us is that there are specific strands of work in the strategy that are specifically, for example, about a Windrush generation, about a Windrush scandals, those specifics. But there's also a chance to look at each of the areas in a more through that lens of anti-racism. With net zero, there's been quite a lot of focus on, for example, how you develop low traffic neighbourhoods in a way that's also age friendly. So there's been quite a lot of just direct interaction around that, so that we're thinking inclusively about the development of low traffic neighbourhoods. But I would say that as we now develop the climate change action plan, there's that opportunity to then influence that further as that's embedded through the voice of older people. So it's both ways. It's how you get the voice of older people influencing the strategy, but how you make sure then that the voice that we're influencing new strategy, but also in the strategy, how you make sure you're looking at that through an equality lens.
Thank you, Sonia. That's really helpful. I now invite Councillor Patrick and if any other members, either in the chamber or online. Councillor Adjari, do you have a question?
All you said is really interesting, really useful. I just wondered how you're differentiating between older people. I mean, you talked about race and sexuality, but there's a very great difference, say, between somebody who's 60 and somebody who's 90, and their needs are very different. And also, have you spoken to people who are approaching, you talk about ageing well strategy, so how are you engaging with people who perhaps aren't older or don't think themselves as older just yet, but are the next generation of older people and who will have different needs perhaps to somebody who's not in their 90s now, somebody who's in their early 60s or middle 60s, who perhaps is, more digital competence, who's got different outlook on life, who's still perhaps working and may work till they're, you say people to go back to work, may carry on working till they're in their late 60s or 70s if they're in good health or whatever. You know, I like the thing about getting people back into work or helping people to get into work. I welcome you're doing the stuff in Kings Park ward, which is my ward. I know there's a lot of residents who, because disability, have had to retire or can't work because disability at quite an early age, and they've almost become old for their time, in a sense. They're probably in their mid-50s, some of them, but they're classed as older people because they're disabled and they can't hold down a full-time job. They've been pushed into old age before their time. Really, these people have been lost to not lost to society, but lost to the workforce because of their disability. And also, we're going to help. What you said, what the council is going to help them. Is the council actually going to look at providing some jobs themselves, or is this all about enabling people to get back into the workforce? Obviously, the council can't employ all of these people, but it'd be good if the council actually reached out and made sure that the jobs it offers are out there for everybody.
So yeah, that point about different groups of older people was one that we thought about a lot, and we had to think about what age we started this strategy from, which is a bit of a false line anyway. So we've gone with over 55, but recognise that, I mean, the ageing process is different. If somebody's had an illness, or again, if somebody's got mental health issues or learning disability, actually the ageing process can start much, you know, in your 40s. So it's trying to recognise that it's about ageing as opposed to an age group, and then recognise that there are people. You know, one of the pushbacks we got in developing the strategy were people who were in their early 50s saying, well, I'm not old, so this has nothing to do with me, and trying to explain that that you're very fortunate then, because some people the aging process is starting, and also you don't know what's around the corner that could impact you. So we have to try and think about an age where we can work preventatively, because this is primarily about prevention. So the focus is primarily on the aging process and what can be done across the borough, as well as then being age friendly. And then the point you make about the difference between somebody who's in their 80s or 90s, I mean, all of that's considered in the strategies. It's just trying to be quite segmented about it, but at the same time not assume. In terms of the other couple of questions, I mean, partnerships with people in place, actually, I know it's just for one area, but we do want to draw out the learning from that. And that gives us an opportunity to start to be more creative about how we work, because the intergenerational work that I talked about, there's an opportunity to say, through intergenerational dialogue, do we actually start to get people to think about aging when they're children, when they're young people, or in their 20s? Because we talked about how do you get people to take seriously what their care needs might be, or what they could do now that could support them, and how could that dialogue help? So that's one of the things that we're keen to test, and organisations are keen to test. In terms of employment, it's I think the council can play its role. But it was primarily about making the employment support system more orientated towards the needs of older people. So not running a separate training project for older people, because that will never be sustainable. And then we could end up with something that starts and then stops. And we've seen plenty of that. So I actually want to use the focus and the resource to work. We've already got DWP wanting to do a pilot in the Hackney Marsh neighbourhood as part of partnerships with people in place. But actually, we've been talking before to Employment Skills, who've already looked at the as a council at great, like, apprenticeships. We've already got not just think about young people for apprenticeships. So there is the opportunity for our own employment, but also for the work that we do working with employers. But it will be about making the systems that support older people into employment more age friendly, and then also looking at age discrimination as well in employers. So it would be more about that than an actual project that delivers actual, like training outcomes or employment outcomes.
Okay, thanks very much, Sonia. I'm conscious of time now, so I've got a question from Councillor Adjare, and depending on how long your question is, I may bring in Councillor Conway as well. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll try to be brief. Thank you, Sonia, for the presentation. I think my question largely relates to the further outreach you're going to undertake. In addition to the 400 people who were consulted initially, I'm keen to kind of gain an understanding how we can get more people involved, ensure more of our older residents have agency over the processes that they're going to be subject to. And I'd just like some clarification as to how those who are already on your committee lead discussions, as opposed to us kind of implementing a pro forma approach where we have various areas that we'd like them to look at. Yeah, I'd like to know how we kind of ensuring that what they personally want raised and investigated does happen. The second question as well was, Councillor Kennedy already touched upon this slightly in terms of the child-friendly places SPD planning document, and the kind of reference to our public spaces being inclusive. Was any consideration given to kind of co-create a document specifically for our older residents as a means of ensuring it's embedded in planning processes going further along down the line? Thank you.
I think you'd probably better take those, Sonia, then I'll move on to Councillor Conway. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So let me start with the middle question, which is about the Hackney Older Citizens Committee and the extent to which they can lead agendas as opposed to, get a big party to a consultation. So very much the idea of getting people involved in those domains, those areas in an open-ended way, was so they could drive what the issue was. And so that was the idea, to have those regular, frequent cycle conversations that were focused on this different area, but it hasn't worked. People have wanted to engage, but when there's a live opportunity to influence something. So we're very conscious, sorry, I should pay tribute to Soraya Zahid, who's just left as well, who, this is her work really, that I'm here because she's left, and I'm going to be recruiting to somebody actually full-time to work on this. But this is something that Soraya and I were with Councillor Maxwell were trying to work through, was if the HOC is more interested in when there's a live opportunity, how do we then address that power dynamic that shifts? So I don't have the answer yet. It's something that we want to look at, and it speaks to my last point about the development of the Hackney Older Citizens Committee, which then brings me on to the first question about how do we scale up the voice of older people. So again, that is something that we'd envisaged the HOC would do. So we would work with enough people that they then had, could help us to reach other people. It wasn't that the HOC became the voice of older people in the borough as a static group. It was that the HOC helped us to reach other people. We've set up the HOC, but we have been through subsequent waves of the pandemic. So we set up the HOC at a time we thought we were coming out. Then we've had Omicron. So it has been, it has been challenging to get that scaled up engagement. But that's why we haven't used the resource either. So there is an opportunity definitely to do that now. But I don't want to underplay the impact that the pandemic has had. We have been able to do the work, but it hasn't been in the way that we might have envisaged in terms of its visibility. And the point about whether we've considered an SPD specifically for older people, there's a manifesto commitment that's about an accessible design guide. So that includes planning, but it goes wider than that. So it is a design guide that would be for public buildings and the public realm, as well as what can be built into SPDs. And so that, I think, where we'd got to as officers was that we'd influenced the child-friendly SPD, but we do welcome the commitment to an accessible design guide, which then is specifically about older people, disabled people, and other people with mobility needs.
Sonia, now bringing Councillor Conway.
Very brief. I'm just thinking about the work that we've been doing on CYP to try and incorporate the voices of a greater number of young people, and was just suddenly struck, because we were listening to everything, by how great it would be if we actually had the HOC, as you keep referring to it, Hackney Older Citizen Committee representation on the commission, just thinking quite specifically about the work that we've been doing around recruitment and retention of foster carers. I know that there's a disproportionate number of foster carers who are over 55, for example. Also know that there's a significant role that over 55s grandparents play in providing childcare, and we're talking about childcare challenges that we're experiencing. So just wonder if there is any scope to have greater involvement in those discussions in the current sort of committees and commissions that we already have.
I'd welcome that opportunity to explore the idea of the HOC giving evidence in the future to commissions, that insight and experience when you're looking at your work programmes. As I say, we are developing the HOC more. So I think these are great ideas to take away and think about. I think Councillor Maxwell would agree with that.
Yeah, great idea. Yeah, thanks, Sonia. So now I think for a final question on this item, Deputy Mayor Bramble, and then I think we're going to move on. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, officers and Councillor Kennedy, for presenting. It was more just a reflection and comment when Councillor Patrick spoke about the different age brackets within people aging well, and just thinking about the intergenerational work that Councillor Maxwell, myself, Councillor Kennedy and Councillor Woodley have been doing on that intergenerational work, and where older people have really been an asset to us within the community, imparting in young people, having that dialogue. I think we even looked at spatial spaces in the park and speaking about park benches, where they would be, why they would be there, why they wouldn't be there, and a young person's perspective of a bench and where it's placed, and an older person's perspective where it should be placed, and also watching that commonality of young people and older people coming together. So just in how that can play into the strategy, where we're really looking at our older people as an asset within our community. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks very much, Deputy Mayor Bramble. I don't think that particularly needs a response, Sonia, but I'm sure we all agree with what Deputy Mayor Bramble said. So I think I'm going to draw this item to a close, but again, thanks very much for bringing this to the Scrutiny Panel. I think it's really, really important, you know, that from our sort of cross-cutting function that we're, you know, that we are aware of this work, and I think the methodology behind it, and also that we can, you know, as part of the council in our, you know, in our commissions, so that this can be embedded in scrutiny as well as across other council services. So thank you very much. Okay, so moving on to agenda item 6, which is the finance update. So council finance is a fixed item in the agenda of Scrutiny Panel. This enables scrutiny members to retain oversight of the council's overall budget, and we've provided 2 reports for members to review in the pack. It's the overall financial position from July 2021. This is which shows the position in the end of March 2022. The council's it shows that in the end of March, as of March 2022, the council is forecast to have a provisional outturn overspend of around 4.6 million in the general fund, an increase of 79,000 from the previous month. And then the capital report from July 2021, which updates members in the current position of the capital programme. So I'd like to welcome Jackie Moylan, the Director of Financial Management. Jackie, please, can you unmute your microphone and provide a brief overview of the key points from the reports? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. If you don't mind, what I was going to do, because those reports were quite backward looking, I was going to put a presentation up on the screen which sort of reflects on the current position for the current year and looking forward, if that's okay with you, Chair.
That would be extremely helpful, because yes, I did have a number of questions about the updated position. Thank you. Welcome to Councillor Hayhurst.
Great, thank you. For those who don't know me, I'm Jackie Moylan, Director of Financial Management. I'm standing in tonight for Ian Williams, who's otherwise engaged. So what I'm planning to do is go through the first forecast for the current financial year, which is just gone online at the moment for next year, for next week's cabinet. Also to take a look at the HRA forecast to reflect on what the medium-term financial plan is for the coming 3 years. To look across what the London picture is, particularly around the impact of inflation, to give you some recent updates around sort of funding levels, but recognising that those updates were before all the resignations and the leadership battle that's currently underway. To go over what the 23-24 budget timeline is, and also a very quick summary of some of the cost of living support we're giving to our residents, which I think is something that's been a key concern of this committee previously, and which we're now taking on board and included in our monthly budget reports. So first of all, the first forecast of the current financial year, which goes to Cabinet on Monday, is a 7.4 million overspend, which is quite a start figure for the beginning of the financial year. What we're seeing is inflation impacting across the piece, but particularly on services where they've got high energy, fuel and contract costs. So for example, in environmental operations, in SEN transport, and also the inflationary pressures in care for care providers and in care packages. We're also very much aware that obviously the pay negotiations for the current year are ongoing, and that there's potentially a gap between what we've budgeted and what might come into fruition, and we don't expect sort of the conclusion of that until later in the financial year. Unsurprisingly, adult social care and children's social care remain a pressure, although we are seeing some reduction in high cost placements in residential placement in children, which is welcome and good news. We're also assuming pressures in areas such as where we collect commercial rent. We recognise that some of our business will be under pressure, and we might have to increase bad debt provisions there, which we're recognising in the forecast. So the cyber attack, unsurprisingly, remains a significant cost, although we did make provision for that in the budget this year, and we did provide an additional reserve as part of the closing for 21-22. And that cost is, as well as sort of IT expenditure, that's around sort of cost of staff for getting systems back up to date, to dealing with backlogs, etc., etc. It's worth noting that what the services are working hard with finance to try to identify areas to offset service pressures, and reflecting just on where we were last year. So in August last year, we was forecasting a overspend of 7.3 million, which by the end of the year, as the chair just mentioned, it came down to 4.6 million. So we'll be very much working hard to try and reduce that pressure over the next few months. And when we report back in September Cabinet, we'd hope to be able to reflect some of those impact of some of those measures. In terms of the HRA is forecast to come in within budget, even though operating expenditure is forecast an overspend, and that's because because of where we are in terms of our building maintenance contracts, we're not expecting to contribute as much to revenue to capital in the current financial year. In terms of the overspends, they're mainly in reactive repairs, where we've got a backlog largely driven by the pandemic, increases in utility costs, estate cleaning, lift service and repairs, all due to inflation. We've got a forecast increase in bad and doubtful debts, and also the cost of council tax and business rates on void properties. I did get because I thought you might be interested. I did get an update in terms of the rent arrears, and effectively that position has stabilised and gone down slightly in the last month, which is relatively good news, but obviously early days. So in moving on, in terms of the medium-term financial plan, Scrutiny would have seen these figures before. So these are the figures that were published as part of the budget report for 22-23. We was looking at for the next financial year a gap of between 14 and 28 million, with the variance largely to do with the impact of any cuts in government funding and the timing of the fair funding review. It's worth pointing out that these figures are cumulative. So if you look at the best case scenario, when we say 14 million for 23-24, that would come off the 29 million for the following year, and there'd be a further 15 million to find, just to clarify that point. In terms of HRA forecast, similarly, there's savings to be found in those areas, and this sets out the next 4 years for the HRA business plan, where at this stage we're looking to find savings of 1.6 million for next year, reducing down to 1 million each year for the following 3 years. In terms of the assumptions and risks in this medium-term financial plan, at the last scrutiny, we highlighted some of these risks, which were around inflation, fair funding, the timing of fair funding and what the impact of fair funding would be, the pace of recovery from the cyber attack, and also increasing demand, particularly on areas like social care and also housing needs, etc. So, and obviously since these plans were drafted, the economic position has worsened, not least the increased inflationary pressure, now at 9.1%, and forecast to grow to greater than 10% by the end of later in the year. I think that's a position that's probably the highest it's been for about 40 years. And we're currently recasting the medium-term financial plan and the HRA business plan, updating those projections. It won't look vastly different for next year, and that's largely because we expect fair funding not to come in 23-24 now, but to be pushed out to 25-26. So that, although it doesn't make our position any better in the longer term, it just gives us that extra couple of years to try to address some of those issues. It's worth mentioning we've contributed to various surveys on inflation in coming months, and we're also, obviously, the council is very much lobbying in terms of the impact of these pressures on our finances and the fact that it's unsustainable going forward. So just to give you a little idea of the London picture. So the London Council did a survey of London boroughs. There was 25 returns. And as you can see there, based on those returns, the estimated cost of general fund pay inflation 22-23 for overall for London was 91 million. So that was the assumption. And an additional 1% in a pay award would cost London overall 40 million. Actually, Hackney is quite significantly affected by that because we've got a high level of insourced services. So a 1% increase in pay does have a significant impact on us, although conversely, other authorities will be greater affected by contractual increase in costs because we've got more services which are outsourced. I'm not going to go through all these figures, but I'll circulate the slides to Tracy afterwards so you can look at those at your leisure and come back with any questions. So in terms of running costs, again, based on 24 London returns on this one, that the overall budget for inflation was around 155 million, but actually an additional 1% cost London-wide 45 million, so quite a significant pressure. And again, that's more detail, which you can look at your leisure after the meeting. So in terms of recent updates, and I will say these slides were drafted before some of the more recent changes, but we think a lot of it will hold good. So one of the things that was announced was that Michael Gove announced that we expect a 2-year settlement this year, and that will be consulted on soon. Probably in the summer was the announcement. We expect that will be later in the summer, given recent events. But this also meant that fair funding will not probably be introduced in 23-24 or 24-25. Or there may be some tinkering with the formula in these years. It's not likely to be as substantial. The other thing that's worth mentioning is that Gove told council not to hold on to false hope of additional funding to help with inflationary pressures. And according to the Chief Secretary of the Treasury, councils facing inflationary pressure will need to tighten their budgets. The reality is that they will need to prioritise services. That just gives you a flavour of the response to the inflationary pressures. In terms of moving forward and the timeline for the budget for 23-24, what we're doing, we're working really closely. It's a shame Sonia's not here actually with the policy team in terms of developing the budget along the same timeline as the new strategic plan has been developed. So directorates and lead members are working with the services to develop budget proposals, and that's in relation to sort of more traditional proposals. But we're also looking at increasing income. We're looking at what we can get from our estates. We're looking at overall staffing savings, for example, through potentially reducing agency spend, etc. So the whole plethora of work that's going on along this timeline, but very much working hand in hand with policy and with the development of the strategic plan. I've added a few slides on here in terms of what we're doing to support residents in terms of off the back of the pandemic and in the current sort of cost of living crisis. So as I think Scrutiny will be aware, the council adopted a poverty framework, which Sonia again was very much integral to developing, and that added priorities around prevention, early years and early help, tackling low wages and cost of living, and responding to the material needs of poverty. And key aspects of that work which are underway include simplifying access to financial support to increase take-up, so that there's a single point of entry, that we're reducing the evidence threshold and the burden that people have to provide in order to access that support, and proactively approaching residents where there are markers and signs that residents might be having issues. We're also building on the learning from the initiatives that were underway during the pandemic, and that means working sort of very closely with the community partnership network, making sure that we're exploring all avenues there to make sure we've got a whole system approach. And finally, making sure that we develop support for people to maximise their income through wider benefit take-up, as well as giving money management advice. So this is just a slide to show, I think this is one of the issues that Scrutiny have asked before about where we are in terms of what we paid out to our residents in financial support. So this is a picture as at the end of June in relation to discretionary housing payments, the Hackney discretionary crisis support scheme, and also the fuel rebates, which you would have all heard about in relation to the fuel costs and how the council tax rebates, which the council is administrating. And also just to emphasise that we will be providing updates to this on a routine basis through the monthly budget report to Cabinet, i.e. the OFP. So that's a new addition, an addition to the Cabinet report for this year, so we can keep a track on that and monitor how much we are spending in those areas to support residents. And finally, this on the cost of living. Sonia, when she was here, she mentioned the Household Support Fund, which we've been allocated £2.8 million for April 22 to September 22. Now, this time round, there's a requirement to spend that in 3/3, a third on pensioners, a third on families with children, rather, and then there's a third which is a discretionary element. And in terms of what the council are doing, so not surprisingly, with the children and families, a large part of that funding is going to support vouchers for children on free school meals, or those identified by local providers as having a particular need, which I think means it is more flexible. So in terms of the amount that was awarded, it's £65 per child, split as set out in the slide. But we're also, this time, a third of the money is allocated to pensioners, so packages of cash support for pensioners to help them with food, fuel bills, etc. And also sort of making sure that we use that single point of entry to signpost those people that need it to be able to access these funds, which I think is really important. And finally, helping with housing costs and bills for people at risk of homelessness or homeless. And the average level of support in that area is around 244 per instance of support. So that's the end of the presentation. So happy to take questions.
Thanks very much, Jackie. Yeah, I'll start off with a couple of questions. I mean, it is really helpful to see what's being done about the, to support residents in relation to the cost of living crisis. But I mean, I think it's a really escalating situation. It's affecting sort of all aspects of residents' lives. I mean, is there anything else that we can do really about the price rises locally, about sort of food supply, about the I mean, I know the cost of fuel is probably outside our sort of remit, but is there anything else to actually reduce the costs that are sort of impacting on people's lives? I mean, I do appreciate we are trying to sort of, maximise their income and simplify systems, but I mean, I think we're really only at the tip of the iceberg of this. So, I mean, is there anything more that we can do?
Can I come back on that question? Because probably I'm not the best place to answer it. It's a shame Sonia wasn't here because she leads on that work. But yeah, I'll take that back.
Thanks very much. I did have another, actually, probably more technical question about the HRA. I mean, obviously, there's been a number of measures made to sort of balance the budget in relation to the HRA, and it's a shame that we've had to limit our sort of contribution from revenue to capital. And I just really wondered again how sort of sustainable that is, because we are, obviously still in the middle of a sort of housing crisis, and whether you think there's going to have to be similar measures next year.
I think it's only something that you could do for a year or two. I think at the moment it's been driven not by a sort of a choice to do that, to stop contributing to capital from revenue. It's been driven by the fact that we've got a sort of slowdown in what we've been doing as a result of the delays in procuring the building maintenance contract, which again there's a lot driven in that by the pandemic and delays in getting surveys, etc. So it's not a conscious decision to stop investing. It's just a byproduct of the pandemic and the slow up of the building contract procurement. So yeah, no, it's not sustainable, and we'd need to sort of come back and look at that in coming years. But then again, we would expect that there to be an upturn in rent collection, etc., in future years as well.
Sorry, actually, well, I've got the floor. A third question for me, and then I invite members. There's a figure in relation to the expenditure and the cyber attack. I just wonder whether it's possible to break that down a little bit more, and also maybe sort of whether there's going to be, you anticipate any further spending on that. Then I'll invite questions from other members. Thank you.
Yes, I'm just going to stop presenting and look back at the report that's online. So. So in terms of the current year, we're estimated to spend 4.2 million in relation to the cyber attack. And what that relates to, as well as ICT expenditure, that's expenditure in revenues and benefits, etc., to update the system. And there's also expenditure in housing needs as well. So all of those service areas where they've got backlogs of work and they need to address those backlogs in order to get the systems up to date. But overall, we're forecasting 4.2 million, and that's just below what we set aside actually as part of the budget setting and as part of the closing of accounts when we put aside extra reserve in relation to cyber, because we could see that some of the work that was happening in the last financial year was carrying on into the new financial year.
Thanks, Jackie. I'm just trying to get my head around just the general fund finances now and the pressures going forward. So if there's a 7.4 million overspend, in the first quarter of, is that right? The financial year?
It's a 7.4 million, which is forecast for the whole year. So it's not.
Oh, I see. So that's the forecast for the whole year.
Yeah, and that includes assumptions in there which may or may not materialise.
I see. And obviously we know there's normally some degree of overspend that's then sometimes made up either through money that's budgeted to either go into reserves or because the council tax take is higher than we've assumed for. But the 7.4 is how much higher, say, than the years before? I'm just trying to get a grip of how much, what sort of situation we're in.
So as in the middle of August last year, we had a very similar overspend projection. What I would say is, and I'll take your point around the 7.4 million. So when we look at the medium-term financial plan that you'll see, that already assumes a level of increase in demand. So although it seems like we're playing catch-up, we do take into account where we are in the current financial year when we set the budget for the following financial year. If you take my point.
I think so, yeah. But then what's concerning us going forward then? So say we're in a similar situation as we were last year, is obviously the future wage inflation pressures and also the general expenses of everything that's fuel linked. And you showed some helpful graphs sort of on a London scale, but let's just look at it from a Hackney point of view. So what's the risk in sort of extra wage inflation? So if we were to give on a Hackney level, if we were to pay staff, say, an extra 1%, for every 1%, how much more does that sort of take out of the budget, as it were?
In terms of the general fund, 1% is around 2 million.
1% to 2 million, fine. And so normally sort of an inflation-linked pay award might be, say, 1 or 2% in historic years. But now, presumably, there's negotiations going on for a much higher one. And so for each percentage point, we're talking possibly a 2 million that we're getting no extra money for the government for, that we then have to find from elsewhere. So that's...
Absolutely. So just to give you a little bit of an indication, so we've made an assumption in the 22-23 budget around the pay award. That assumption won't be sufficient. Yes. So we need to find a way of funding that for this year. But when we're recasting the medium-term financial plan, which we are doing at the moment for 23-24, we will build in a catch-up for 22-23 and an assumption for 23-24 as well.
So you'll build into that then the higher level of...
Yes, indeed.
I see. And in terms of the extra costs generally to the council are mainly energy linked, presumably, obviously, because these have all sort of materialised in the last 6 to 7 months and couldn't have been foreseen. Obviously, next year we're presumably working. There's going to be what we saw there for the best, middle, and worst case scenarios for next year will presumably need to get, because the work you're talking about revisiting will presumably have to be revisited.
Yeah, we've done most of that work. We're just finalising it. So we did make a provision in the current year's budget for the increase in fuel costs.
Right.
It won't be sufficient, as you point out. Things weren't known at the time when we set the budget, and that will be feed into the following year's forecast. In terms of the gap for next year, the thing that mitigates that gap a bit is around that fair funding, sort of timing of that fair funding. So that offsets part of the inflationary pressure, but that doesn't say takes it. It almost just pushes it a little bit into the longer grass.
I see. So in other words, because we had budgeted on this new fair funding formula, which we thought wasn't going to be as advantageous to Hackney, we'd already baked in a bit of that. But because that's not happening straight away, that's big. And so, okay, thank you for that. And then, so okay, that's helpful just to try and get sort of a situation. So in broad terms at the moment, to be crude about it, we're not bleeding the reserves significantly compared to previous years, but there's obviously, unless we budget accordingly on the medium-term forecast and make savings appropriately, there's a risk we fall into that category. Is that sort of a fair summary?
Yeah, there's always at risk. I think it's also fair to point out that obviously that there has been some impact on our reserves from the cyber attack and from COVID as well. So yeah, but we're not in that category.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I mean, I've got further questions, but I've taken up quite a bit of time there, so I'll hand over to Conway.
I think it's Councillor Conway's turn now. Councillor Hayhurst, but you can come in if we have time.
Thank you. It's quite a specific one, so you may not have a response to this. But it's about, I suppose it's good to see that we're seeing a reduction in the cost of the high cost residential settings for children, which I know that was a big area of overspend for us. I just wondered if we know why that is, and if that's sustainable, if we anticipate that it's something that can be sustained, or that we might see further reductions in subsequent years.
I think I have spoken to the director. I think it is because what is happened is that I think less young people have gone into residential care, which means that when they turn 18 and they're no longer in residential care, the net figure comes down. If you see what I mean. So I think it is potentially sustainable, and I think there's a lot of good work going on in that direction to try and avoid those high cost placements, and also get the sort of better outcomes for the young people as well by them not going into residential care. It's something we monitor every month, and it'll be in the IFP report every month in terms of numbers in residential care. And I think we was down to to a level we were about 1 or 2 years ago now. So it was really quite good news in terms of, there's more detail in the report which goes to Cabinet, which will give you more on the figures, but relatively good news there, but still a significant pressure.
I mean, thanks, Jackie. I think it sort of maybe leads me on into, but there are already other areas of our procurement really, which, where there are pressures, where, there could be maybe further reviews in relation to that. And I think that's something that Scrutiny Panel may have an interest in, I think, throughout the year. But if you've got any sort of initial thoughts, and that'd be really helpful, then I'll bring in Councillor Adejare.
Thank you, Chair. My question relates to the education asset management budget. I think what drew my attention was overspends being rolled over to the next fiscal year. And given the opaqueness in respect of settlements over the next 2 years, 3 years or so, I just wanted to kind of get an understanding as to how, if any, a precarious position this leaves those schools in, particularly with inflationary rises, and if any essential works need to be carried out within that period. Thank you.
Yeah, I think you're referring to possibly the capital update report and the information in the capital report. So yeah. So that's not unusual. So when you've got capital projects and big capital programs, sort of monies do tend to move between years as things get prioritised and deprioritised. I think that the issue in terms of the capital program, what is more of a risk is around that sort of construction price inflation. So I wouldn't be so concerned about the expenditure moving between years as much as sort of the overall cost, which is going to cause a pressure on capital budgets.
Thanks, Jackie. And Councillor Hayhurst.
Jackie, just sort of hone in on an area on, say, energy costs. I don't know whether the council, was in a bulk buy contract that may have been at a point where it was much lower rate. So can you just fill us in? Has that expired, and have you fixed in at a sort of a different rate, and sort of, but then also I'm aware there's that cost, but then there's also our outsourced costs that we might then have the secondary. But let's just deal with that first phase of obviously you've got the heating of the Lido to the town hall and all of those things. And then, so what is the sort of, where are we at that, re-procuring that, and how does that feed into sort of a working group on possibly capital spend on something like solar, with the new energy cost being much higher? I appreciate you can't solar your way out of winter, but you certainly can do a lot, and so the payback can now become a much better in the summer months. So just to give us some idea of the thinking around that.
So in terms of the sort of the buying power, we do tend to buy up front. I think we got a relatively good deal for the current financial year because we bought most of it last October. So there was some positivity there, although there was still an increase. In terms of, obviously there would be potential benefits for investment in solar power. I can't answer the detail on that, so it might be worth me taking that away if you don't mind, and we can.
So I suppose but then, so if we purchased last October, which would have been just at the start of the rises, of the wholesale rises, if I'm right, so that wouldn't have been too bad at all. Was that a year purchase? So in other words, we come out to bulk.
I think it was most of our purchase for the year. So we'll see a bigger rise in 23, 24 than we did in 22, 23, and we're factoring that in going forward. But obviously that we could see further shocks as well. So we need to keep our eye on it and keep sort of monitoring it as the year goes on as well. Because as you say, it's not just about our fuel consumption; it's about the knock-on impact of the increase in energy costs in some of our suppliers, like our care providers, etc. as well.
Yeah, I mean, just to take away the more specific point, as I understand it, sort of with the increased unit cost of solar now, essentially anything you use in the summer months, you're on a sort of a 2 to 3 year payback essentially by purchasing bulk solar panels. Obviously you can't, in your winter months, there's not as much sun.
Yeah.
So the UK does, you can't, it doesn't really help much there. But for that six months where there's more sun of the year, I think a lot of businesses are now looking at a 2-3 year payback. So it's pretty much a no-brainer as I understand it. And then we've obviously got a lot of roof space. So I mean, I suppose that's an area. I don't know how much we could possibly be talking about saving, but I would advocate some serious consideration.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on this, so I'm not gonna guess, but I'll so maybe I'll take that one away.
Okay, I can't see any more hands, so I think I'm going to draw this item to a close. I mean, thanks very much, Jackie, for your presentation and your continuous engagement with the Scrutiny Panel, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time. To agenda item 7, which is the minutes of the previous meeting, and matters arising. I don't think we've got any matters arising. So are there any comments in the minutes, or are they agreed? That's a true read. Sorry? So apologies, the minutes are going to follow. So okay, so now moving on to agenda item 8, which is the Scrutiny Panel Work Programme for 2022-23. So individual scrutiny commissions and Scrutiny Panel develop a new work programme each municipal year. The work programmes of respective commissions are currently in development, the process of being agreed and finalised. To aid this process, a public consultation survey was launched. We asked stakeholders and local residents for their suggested topics. Note the responses received on pages 77 to 111 in the agenda. An outline of the work programme suggestions collated by each scrutiny commission is also outlined in the agenda. Please note there's a long list of suggestions. The work programme for each scrutiny commission is subject to agreement. And then the different suggestions are outlined in different parts of the agenda. Scrutiny Panel's role is maintaining collective oversight of all scrutiny work. So I will now invite, I think we're only represented by 3 commissions tonight, because unfortunately there's nobody from Skills Economy and Growth. The chairs of the commissions to maybe briefly comment on their work programme as far as you can at this stage, starting with Councillor Hayhurst.
I'd like to say we did this earlier on Monday.
Yeah,
This
I
will be
mean,
a repetition.
a very brief summary would be, I think, just helpful for the purpose of.
Well,
of-
okay, then
yeah.
just from, I mean,
It's a public facing meeting,
Yeah.
obviously. Yeah, so it's different.
so
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
we obviously have an internal meeting on Monday, but
Yeah.
some of the areas that we're looking to look at in health is there's the new integrated care system that's essentially took effect a few months ago in Hackney in North East London, and we're conscious there of essentially money and commissioning possibly happening at a higher level than it has previously, and how that impacts upon meaningful commissioning for Hackney residents. So there's work to be looked at there. There's obviously a recent Panorama documentary being undertaken in terms of some GP practices that have been privatised and some of their internal practices, and we're asking questions with respect of that at the inner North East London meeting coming forward. I think there's work to be done in terms of people who are coming out of CAMS and young adults and the mental health support provision that is there. There is, of course, an ongoing piece of work in terms of health inequalities that we continue to look at. We've just recently done an interesting piece of work in terms of air quality and understanding the health benefits with respect of that. And Councillor Kennedy has helpfully also highlighted a number of areas of challenges that the council face is in terms of sort of the cap that the residents are expected to pay towards care costs and new deprivation of liberty provisions, all of which are causing a significant amount of work internally that we need to look at and understand in terms of the ramifications. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I do apologise for ambushing you, but you raised the challenge admirably. Councillor Conway, are you okay doing something similar? Then I come to Councillor Angiare.
It's not going to be as long as Councillor Hayhurst, I'm afraid. We had our Children and Young People Scrutiny Commission meeting this week, where this Monday, where we reviewed all of the suggestions that have been submitted. We're still yet to have sort of determined where we're going to and how we're going to incorporate many of these. But the key themes that we think have been emerging from the previous work programme, but also through many of the suggestions that have come through, and also topical issues that have been arising in the borough, are to have a look at behaviour management in schools. In particular, this is linked to, in part, the exclusions review that was published last December, but also questions around school behaviour management that have been raised by the public awareness, should I say, of the Child Q case. We're also keen to have a look at race, racism and children's social care. And this is acknowledging that many of the disparities that we see in education are also present in children's social care, but perhaps the public have less of an awareness of. So we're quite keen to potentially explore that. We're also hoping to look at special educational needs and to get a sense of the number of young people in the borough who have education healthcare plans, and who they are, and when people are accessing education healthcare plans, what schools are they attending, how many of these young people are out of school, and to get a sense of that demographic and whether there is any more that we're able to do to get education healthcare plans and assessments done in a more timely manner, and to address any disparities or inequalities that might be evident from the data that we receive. We're also generally going to be looking at SEND restructure and the better value review, and also another topical one in relation to COVID, I suppose, is the children missing education, which previously we have, in a roundabout way, sort of had a look at this, but I think more specifically this is in response to the fact that we're seeing an increasing number of children and young people who haven't really returned to school after we saw numbers falling during COVID, and parents obviously opting for home educating, and we're wanting to explore what's behind that. And so yes, that's a bit of a those are the main themes, but there are lots of other suggestions that have been put forward by the public and commission members that we are going to be working on over the next few weeks to try and find ways of incorporating them into our work programme.
Thank you very much, Councillor Conway. Councillor Adjari, if you are able to do something similar, that would be great. Thanks so much. So sorry to ambush you as well, but I'm sure you'll rise to the challenge.
Thank you, Chair. We only met yesterday, was our first formal meeting, and as such, nothing has been put in place. It was more of a general discussion, but the kind of key themes were largely centred on housing provision, affordability, tenure across the borough, and looking forward, so anticipating changes in terms of our demographics and how we accommodate them in respect of our housing provision. So not as we've made a commitment in the manifesto to kind of bring into stream 1,000 council homes. So this is aside from that. So it's looking at, you know, whether shared ownership is something we need to look at further, independent living for our older residents, and potentially having it been a topic that's been looked at in conjunction with CYP. Housing for care leavers is something which could also arise within that piece of work. The sense is that would be a standalone commission. It'd be a big piece of work, which would then feed into the Scrutiny Commission. But either way, it's something that we need to discuss in Hackney. The sense was, you know, Hackney is a place for everyone, so we have to ensure that our housing can accommodate everyone across the board. Naturally, policing is going to be an ongoing area of work within the Commission. I think as well as the kind of follow-up to post the release of the IOPC report, there was a sense that we should also look at policing of drugs in Hackney and the kind of disparity between certain groups. So within the anti-racism framework, potentially in respect of young people as well, but there was a sense that we also needed to look at that from a health perspective as well, Councillor Hayhurst. So potentially that's a discussion we'll need to have with him, but I think it's an important one to have. There's a trial being going on in Lewisham at the moment, I believe, where they are trying to look at ways and means of being able to support people who are arrested with small quantities of drugs, Class B, and referrals or kind of directing them to services which can provide them with support they need, which we think would be helpful in our own borough as well. In terms of general issues, the closure of the neighbourhood offices is something that we wanted to revisit, the impact on residents, whether they're working or not, and also the introduction of community hubs, which could possibly kind of further support that framework. And retrofitting is another area, of course, we have to look at. It was touched upon under Councillor Patrick's leadership, and it's something that we would like to kind of get our teeth into again. And I think in respect of anti-racism, our approach as an authority and a kind of all-encompassing approach as well, which we hope is going to be filtered down across all commissions. We were also interested in, well, I in particular was interested in looking at the arts and culture offer in our borough and how that manifests itself in terms of funding in particular. So those are some of the things. Nothing's finalised as yet, but policing's definitely going to be in there. Housing's definitely going to be in there. Retrofitting's definitely going to be in there. That's where I am at the moment, Chair. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And obviously, neither of the lead members for Skills Economy and Growth was able to be here this evening, but there is a long list of Skills Economy and Growth suggestions which has been circulated with the papers. I don't know whether anyone's got any comments on that or on the other work programmes. I mean, obviously, I think it's a very, very rich and ambitious work programme across the commissions. Is obviously, you know, a number of different sort of cross-cutting areas where I think we will be collaborating across the commissions. And I think it's going to be, well, a very, very busy year for scrutiny. I think there's, I think we're really in the driving seat, I think, in really sort of holding the executive and the, you know, the council to account on behalf of the communities that we serve. So thanks very much for that. So in relation to Scrutiny Panel work programme, the following items are currently scheduled for discussion. October 2022, we've got the Chief Executive question time. So if you've got any suggestions for discussion areas, either tonight or by email. And then the finance update, and then the annual complaints and members' inquiries report. February 23, got the Mayor's question time, and again, we'll be circulating for discussion, and the finance update. And then April 23, got the finance update. So those are the standing items. And obviously in Scrutiny Panel, we also, as we have tonight with the Ageing Well strategy, explore sort of cross-cutting policies. And we've also got the ability to have task and finish groups under Scrutiny Panel, which I think, which are going to be items that we're both going to be exploring during this municipal year. We conducted a task and finish group last year in relation to the council tax reduction scheme, which we're still working on concluding. So there are some suggestions for cross-cutting pieces. I mean, I think in particular climate action plan, although that obviously sits in aspects of it sit in different commissions, but I mean, I think the governance and accountability sits with Scrutiny Panel. I think that's really great. I mean, I think it was very, very clear from suggestions put forward by the public that is, a matter of, significant concern. And then again, I think the cost of living crisis, building on the work with CTRS is another area I think where we need more significant work. And then across, the cross-cutting anti-racism strategy. I mean, I'd also like to, and again, this feeds into the manifesto commitment, I think build, whether on panel or, by means of a task and finish group in relation to the council's consultation and engagement with residents, because again, that's a manifesto commitment. I think that is something which it would be really, really helpful for us to explore in a more detailed way. So those are suggestions to Scrutiny Panel. I don't know whether anyone's got any sort of comments on that or any sort of further responses. Councillor Henniher?
Just to get my head around the timeline for the climate action plan, if I understood Councillor Coburn correctly, it's nearing completion. And so hang on, if we're in July, what publication in the autumn? Is that consultation in the autumn, but consultation on a completed document? So, I mean, and so do we want that at the next meeting is what, October? Do we want to make some time to feed into that meaningfully at that stage if this body's holding the ring on that? Because that seems to be the appropriate time, doesn't it?
I mean, I can see a lot of sense in that, actually, Councillor Hayter. It's obviously going to be challenging in terms of timetabling, but I think it's something that Tracy and I are going to have to take away. I mean, we do have the Chief Executive's question time. I think, in terms of him holding the pen on that,
well, I think the two, I think the two can be linked. I don't see them as exclusive as one another necessarily.
Really, Councillor Conway?
Just to say that I'm very much in agreement with the suggestions that have been put forward, in particular the anti-racist action plan, which was something that I think CYP was hoping to look at. But I have to say, the more I keep thinking about it and the experiences that we've had of looking at what's been sort of drafted in relation to that thus far, the more I feel as though it really does have to be looked at from a broader corporate perspective. It just, in particular, whenever we're talking about anything in relation to our corporate parenting responsibility, it's abundantly clear that we can't just be talking about services that are specifically delivered to children and young people, and have to think more holistically across the council. So yes, but something else which I think you'd alluded to, forgive me if I'm wrong, but to look at procurement, because I really do feel as though we've done a piece of work on scrutiny around the, around independent send provision, and I really got the sense that that added a huge amount of value to the pieces of work that were sort of already going on at that stage. I also think it's incredibly important for members to have a hold on, we're constantly hearing financial updates about this is what we're spending on, but what does that actually look like? What does it actually look like? Are we getting value for money? I think it's really important for us to know this, and for us to be able to bring our expertise and expertise of panelists and community residents to determine whether the community feels that we're getting value for money, and if there's anything more that we can do in these sort of pressured times. So I would definitely advocate that we look at procurement.
Thank you, Councillor Conway. That's really, really helpful. So, are there any further comments? Councillor Agiari, Councillor Patrick? No. There was a couple of one other thing I was going to mention actually was that the we're going to finish very shortly. Councillor Hayhurst was the see you looking odd. Yes, was the current constitutional review is there are sort of revised proposals in relation to scrutiny, and I think it would be whether formally at a meeting or I think there should be some input from Scrutiny Panel in relation to the Constitutional Committee view of the sections of the Constitution dealing with scrutiny, which is across the commissions and also with the role of Scrutiny Panel. So I think that's something we're going to have to work with Deputy Mayor Bramble to sort of feed into. So. There are some changes. I'm not going to go into it now, but there are some changes. But I mean, I think also it's an opportunity for change. So it's an opportunity to sort of feed into that and, sort of modernise and see whether it actually reflects, our aspirations as a scrutiny as well. And also, I mean, there's going to be, there's a number of different aspirations for the constitutional committee, the constitutional review. I mean, it's also to make it more accessible to the public, sort of plain language and that thing as well, and those sort of things as well. So I think it would be useful for us to review and feed into that in some appropriate way. Thank you. Having concluded that, it's now agenda item 9. Any other business haven't been notified of anything? So I now formally declare the meeting closed. Thank you very much.